Shall we do it one more time? The House will be in order. Will you please take your conversations off the floor? Frank, you ready? Does the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, seek recognition?
Yes, Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.Res. 271.
Without objection, so ordered.
And Madam Speaker, I'd at this time like to yield 3 minutes to the sponsor of the
Gentleman,
bill.
call up the House resolution. 271.
Yes.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 271, resolution condemning the Trump administration's legal campaign to take away Americans' health care.
Pursuant to House Resolution 274, the resolution is considered read. The resolution shall be debatable for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, and the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden, each will control 30 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to yield 3 minutes.
Just 1 minute, please. The House will be in order. Please take your conversations off the floor. Mr. Plum.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to initially yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Allred, who is the sponsor of the resolution.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Pallone, for your leadership, and thank you, Madam Speaker. I am proud to lead the charge on this resolution condemning the administration's attacks on Americans' health care in federal court. With the support of so many of my colleagues, this resolution puts the United States Congress on the record as being on the side of the people. As this administration seeks to tear down our healthcare system, this Congress will not stand by while cynical and partisan attacks on our healthcare system and that of hardworking Americans. Whether it is allowing young people to stay on their parents' insurance until they are 26, or protecting people from lifetime caps, or ensuring folks with pre-existing conditions get the care that they need, this should not be a partisan issue. The fight to protect pre-existing conditions is personal for me. My mother is a breast cancer survivor, and my wife Allie and I just celebrated the birth of our son. Both of those are pre-existing conditions. And concern about health care is by far the #1 issue that my constituents talk to me about back home. That brings me to Natalie, a lawyer with young children, Hugo and Mia, who is married to Nathan, a law professor at SMU. Nathan recently attended the State of the Union with me here in Washington. I met Natalie on the same day the House voted to repeal the Affordable Care Act. I learned that she had stage 4 cancer, and that she had come to my event from her chemotherapy treatment. She explained to me that her goal was to fight her cancer for as long as she could, so that her 2 children would know her. Natalie came to my event that day because she was worried about future moms who would lose their care if the Affordable Care Act was repealed. She was concerned about a return to the bad old days with lifetime caps and discrimination against people with pre-existing conditions. Sadly, Natalie passed away last year, but her fight goes on, a fight that I am honored to carry forward on behalf of North Texans here in Washington. My home state of Texas has the highest uninsured rate in the country. 1 in 5 people in Dallas County, where I live, do not have health insurance. We can and must do better. I urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, in the House and the Senate, to join us in condemning these attacks on our healthcare system. We must make sure that we don't go back to the bad old days where people can be thrown off their health care just because they got sick. This resolution is a good first step, but we must come together to help our constituents by working together to pass legislation that will stabilize our system and lower costs for everyone. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Well, good afternoon, Madam Speaker. I thank you, and I yield myself such time as I may consume. The
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The American people expect us to come to this floor with solutions, not political gotcha statements. The resolution before us in this week's Democratic dosage of attack on the president is just that. It doesn't do a darn thing to protect people with pre-existing conditions, not one thing. On the opening day of the 116th Congress, House Republicans brought a powerful but simple measure to the floor that called on this body to legislate on what we all agree needs to be done, locking in protections for patients with pre-existing conditions. Let me repeat. Republicans acted on day one of this Congress to protect Americans with pre-existing conditions. Democrats blocked that. Democrats blocked that. In fact, I introduced legislation which has 45 co-sponsors that protects people with pre-existing conditions, period. This is something I've fought for my entire time in public service. It would lock in existing protections for patients. It's before the Energy and Commerce Committee, and I've worked since the first day of this Congress to get this measure passed so that if the court decision that found Obamacare to be unconstitutional, if that judge's decision is upheld, we want to make sure that our citizens who have pre-existing conditions still have coverage. The legislation I've sponsored would do that. Republicans and Democrats could get this done. And the question is, why are we not voting on that today? Instead, Democrats have rushed a resolution to the floor that has never had a hearing before the Energy and Commerce Committee. So much for the talk about due process and regular order, Madam Speaker. No hearing, rushed to the floor. We only got to see it for the first time last Friday. So it's little more, in my opinion, than a political screed, not a public policy proposal. It will never go to the Senate. It's only here. Americans ought to know this, too, that the legal case working its way through the courts did not immediately end Obamacare and will not affect insurance coverage on premiums for 2019. Moreover, Democrat attorneys general and a couple of Republicans from intervening states are already defending the law in this case, and the judge's ruling has been appealed. And this body has voted not once but twice to allow Speaker Pelosi to intervene in the case, and she has moved to do so. Now, just as my Democratic colleagues have repeatedly refused to let this House approve protections for people with pre-existing conditions, they also know they could moot the lawsuit if that they so decry today. All they would have to do is bring a bill to the floor and vote to repeal the individual mandate. That would turn off this lawsuit. I'm sure many on our side might be happy to join them in that effort. And if the Democrats didn't want to do that, they could vote to reinstate the individual mandate penalty. That too would moot the lawsuit. But we're not doing that either. So they had policy options that could have been brought to the floor, 3 of them. 2 would have ended the lawsuit that they decry today, and 1 would have given rock-solid security to those with pre-existing condition if the law is thrown out. And there is no difference between us or among us about protecting people with pre-existing conditions. But unfortunately, they chose not to actually legislate. Democrats control everything in this House. They decide what gets heard in committee, or in this case not, and what's brought to the floor or not. So it is clear they'd rather play politics with health care and attack the president for political purposes rather than work with us on what could and should be bipartisan solutions. The fact that my friends on the other side of the aisle must acknowledge is, for many Americans seeking coverage, health care costs keep getting more and more expensive. Last week, the Bend Bulletin, a newspaper in my district, reported on a recent analysis by the Kaiser Family Foundation about how insurance premiums are out of reach for many older middle-class residents of our area, particularly in rural areas, including my home state. They report, and I quote, "In Central Oregon, for example, a 60-year-old individual with an annual income of $50,000 must pay at least $703 a month, representing 17% of his or her income, and that would only buy a bronze plan with a deductible of $6,500. We should be focused on helping people like that be able to afford insurance. When the Affordable Care Act passed, Democrats promised people their insurance premiums would actually go down by $2,500. For many in America, that promise was false. For many Americans, health care costs, health insurance premiums, and certainly deductibles and copays have nothing but gone up and up and up. I was in Oregon over the weekend, held 7 town halls. You know what I hear about when it comes to health care? That insurance premiums are out of reach for too many of my constituents. And for those who cannot afford the premiums, many make difficult choices, from choosing which family members to cover to changing jobs or limiting income in order to continue to qualify for subsidies. This is a real problem, and I think we could find a bipartisan solution if Democrats were willing to work with us on it. But plainly, the current health care system for too many Americans is not working. So we know we have more work to do, and I hope that our colleagues on the other side of the aisle would agree with us that we need to improve state markets that in some part were damaged by Obamacare, that we should work together to lower health care costs and increase access to private health insurance. And in the Energy and Commerce Committee, actually, there are some things we're working on drug costs, and no president in my memory has ever leaned farther forward to get drug costs down for American consumers than President Trump. He's been an incredible leader in this effort, and we're going to see bipartisan work get marked up tomorrow in the Energy and Commerce Committee. So on that topic of health care that's so crucial to the survivability of American consumers, we can move forward. We've proven that. But meanwhile, the American people need to fully understand that the Democrats' one-size-fits-all government-run plan itself would end the Affordable Care Act. You have to admit that. That's what your Medicare for All plan does. They need to understand the $32 trillion price tag for the Democrats' alternative and the tax increases that would be necessary to go with it, the doubling of the individual income tax, doubling of corporate tax. Providers would have to take a 40% reduction in their payments. Think of what the wait lines will be if that were to become law. Americans need to know that when the Democrats' Medicare for All plan ends, employer-sponsored health care and your union plans you negotiated for, 158 million Americans who have health insurance today will lose it tomorrow. They need to understand how they'd have to wait longer for access to care than they do today. And for my older friends, they need to understand the worst-case scenario. Seniors in America need to fully understand how this plan does away with popular Medicare Advantage plans and Medigap plans, and impacts this proposal would have on access to their doctors and an earlier bankruptcy of Medicare altogether. So we would be better served today, and so would the American people, if we stood down, parked our partisan swords and shields, and worked together to solve the real problems Americans face when they go to pay their family bills. I had lunch today with a couple from the southern part of my district, professionals. They said the cost of health insurance for them is so high, they've had to make the choice not to have it. Not to have it. This is going on every day in the marketplace. And I wish we could come together and spend our time on this House floor with a solution we could agree upon, because I think we could. But that's not what we're doing today. It's like every week there has to be a resolution on the floor to condemn the president, something he said or did. Not a policy proposal will actually solve the nation's problems. And that's all you're dealing with today, another screed. So let's work together. Let's come together as this Congress can, and as the Energy and Commerce Committee has had a wonderful record of doing over the years and can going forward, to address health care and other issues. We can do that. So, Madam Chair, with that, I reserve the balance of my time and encourage my colleagues to vote no on this partisan political resolution.
The gentleman from Oregon reserves. I would remind you to please take your conversations off the floor because the House is not in order. The gentleman from New Jersey is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 1 minute now to our Majority Leader from Maryland.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I would hoped that we could do what the gentleman from Oregon wants to do and work together in a bipartisan fashion. I will say to him, however, that his party was in control from 2011 to last year, and there was almost no effort to accomplish that objective. There were, however, over 65 votes to repeal, and there was no replace. When you won the presidency as well, there was no replace. We passed something through this House that couldn't get through the Senate. Senate was controlled by your party. This is something that's not optional for any of our citizens. Health care is essential, and they expect us to sit down and work together. Unfortunately, today we saw in a tweet the president, who campaigned on the basis of everybody was going to be covered at less cost and higher quality. We are now, I suppose, in about the 26th month of the president's term. Maybe more than that, 29 months into the president's term. He has sent us no bill. And this morning, he has the gall, in my opinion, to tell the American people, I got a plan. It's secret, and I'll show it to you in 2021. What's interesting about 2021? After the election. Elections ought to be about policy. 2018 was about policy, health care, and very frankly, our argument prevailed. Our argument that was we wanted to protect the Affordable Care Act, that we wanted to make sure that the protections included in the Affordable Care Act were available to all Americans. Madam Speaker, I want to thank Representative Allred for introducing this resolution, and I rise in support of it. Since taking office, President Bush has been focused, and his administration, on doing everything it can to take affordable health care coverage options away from American families. You can make health care a lot cheaper, or from no coverage. Very simple. Not hospitalization, not doctors' reimbursement, not this, not that, not the other. We call them junk policies. They pretend to be health coverage when they are not. The president did make two failed efforts, along with his party, to repeal the Affordable Care Act in Congress. Came after Republicans tried to repeal or undermine the bill in more than 65 votes during their years in the majority. The American people do not want to get rid of the Affordable Care Act, because if they did, they wouldn't have us in the majority, because they know we want to keep it. They want Congress, however, to work to improve and make our health care system work better for all Americans, and yes, have it affordable and accessible. Instead, President Trump and Republicans have doubled down and tripled down on their agenda of sabotaging the law through executive actions on an almost weekly, monthly basis, through executive actions and through lawsuits like the one now pending in Texas. I'm not sure who convinced the president to change his mind, but I have a suspicion that Mick Mulvaney did. Mick Mulvaney, of course, voted 65 times. Well, I don't know that he was here every one of those votes, but every time he had an opportunity, he voted to repeal the Affordable Care Act. If the Americans wanted to repeal the Affordable Care Act, they would have voted against us. What this resolution does, Madam Speaker, and I would tell my friend from Oregon, if it's partisan because none of you will support it. And so many of you campaign on the basis of wanting to protect pre-existing conditions. Obviously, the president changed his mind about doing that. All this resolution does is express the sense of this House that such efforts are wrong and would harm tens of millions of Americans who benefit from the ACA. This includes 133 million or more Americans living with pre-existing conditions like asthma, diabetes, cancer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, who are protected in their ability to get health care insurance. The actions taken by President Trump, however, and Republicans would make these individuals uninsurable, forcing them and their families into financial hardship in order to pay for medical bills. It also includes older Americans for whom Republicans have proposed an age tax. And it would do harm to the 20 million Americans who are now covered because the Affordable Care Act would lose their coverage, as a result of what President Trump and Republicans in Congress are seeking to do. That's what the lawsuit does. This says we don't agree with the lawsuit. Pretty simple proposition. By joining the Texas lawsuit, the Trump administration is seeking to allow women to be charged higher premiums than men as they used to be. Seeks to allow lifetime annual limits on coverage, which the Affordable Care Act banned. And in addition, is trying to force Americans under age 26 to get coverage on their own, even if they don't have a job yet and they're still in college. Preventive health visits and screenings would once more require out-of-pocket copays. Plans would no longer be required to cover essential health benefits. Now, if you don't have to cover required health benefits, you're going to get a cheaper policy. Not a lot of coverage, but cheaper policy. The objective is not just a cheaper policy, it is a policy that covers your risks. And if we can make it cheaper, we ought to do that. Plans would no longer be required to cover, as I said, essential benefits such as maternity care or prescription drugs. This resolution is an opportunity to state on the record whether members support doing away with these reforms or not. Now, that doesn't mean you think that an alternative is perfect. It simply means that we either want to improve or replace with something that's viable and passable and good for the American people. Whether to turn back the clock or look ahead. And whether to stand with the Trump administration as it seeks to dismantle every single piece of the Affordable Care Act, which it has done. And the gentleman mentions maybe a daily resolution. Well, unfortunately, we have a daily action by the president that does things that we don't think are appropriate. We voted on one of those the other day where we appropriated money to a certain object and the president wants to change it on his own. We think that was unconstitutional. We didn't get a lot of help on the Republican side of the argument. The gentleman did. I agree with that. The gentleman who has spoken before me. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join me and others in supporting Representative Allred's resolution and expressing bipartisan opposition to the Trump administration's efforts. Not to Trump, but to the policies. We ought to be talking about policies, not personalities. It's not about personalities. It's about policies. And do we believe that we ought to repeal the Affordable Care Act without a replacement? I think the answer to that ought to be an emphatic no for all of us. And the gentleman's correct. We ought to work on a bipartisan basis to accomplish good objectives for our people. This vote will show every single American where his or her representative stands on the question, which is so consequential to the everyday lives of millions and millions of Americans. The president clearly has no intention, he said in his tweet today, no intention of sending a bill down here until 2021, 2 years and more from now. How sad to be the leader of our country and say, I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to do. Just trust me. Well, Mr. President, we don't have any reason, based upon your performance, to trust you to make sure that Americans have what you said you were going to give them. Everybody was going to be covered at lower cost or higher quality. Vote for this resolution and tell the American people when you said on the campaign trail, I'm for pre-existing conditions, you meant it. When you said there were other protections that you wanted to keep in the bill, you meant it. And if you do, you will vote for this resolution and send a message. Democracy is a lot about messages, about talking to one another. This is the way the Congress can talk to the administration. One way, we can talk in a lot of ways. Have that communication be clear. Mr. President, Leave the Affordable Care Act alone and work with us to make it better and work for all Americans, which is what you said you would do during the course of the campaign. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. I would remind members to address their remarks to the chair. The member from Oregon is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Could I inquire as to how much time each side has?
From Oregon has 20.5 minutes.
Okay.
And the gentleman from New Jersey has 26.5 minutes.
Wow.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just want to make a couple of comments. First of all, the President was very good to work with, and we worked in a bipartisan manner last Congress to address the nation's opioid epidemic. That's a health care issue and a life and death issue. We passed 60 bipartisan bills. They became law, and President Trump signed that. We extended health insurance for children in America, the CHIP program, Children's Health Insurance Program, for 10 years. That's twice as long as ever had been done before. We did that on the Energy and Commerce Committee. The President signed that. That's, in my state, 122,700 Oregon kids and pregnant moms covered for certainty for 10 years under that insurance program. We reauthorized and fully funded community health centers. 240,000 Oregonians, 63 sites in my district get their health care from community health centers, Madam Speaker. And we did that, fully funded, record level. Now, I just want to address something my friend, the majority leader who schedules bills on the floor, said about how we voted to repeal Obamacare 65 times. What he kind of failed to mention is Democrats voted for not quite half of those, I would wager, because 25 of those votes became law, signed in large part, if not totally, by one Barack Obama. Because there were problems in the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, however you want to describe it, that this Congress interceded on and in a bipartisan way voted to repeal, quote unquote, Obamacare. That's what the leader said. Those 65 were all to repeal. I would argue he probably voted for a bunch of those because some of them passed unanimously in the House and Senate, and even President Obama agreed there were mistakes in Obamacare. And our argument is we can fix America's health care laws going forward, and we should. With that, I would yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Montana, a terrific new member of Congress in the Energy and Commerce Committee, Mr. Gianforte.
The gentleman from Montana is recognized.
Thank the gentleman for the time. Madam Speaker, I hear from hardworking Montanans in my office and throughout the state that they're worried about the rising cost of health care. Rising premiums, increasing deductibles force Montana families to spend more and more on health care and less on clothes and books and food for the table. Since my first day in office, I've made lowering health care costs, promoting rural access to care, and protecting those with pre-existing conditions my primary priorities. Unfortunately, the Affordable Care Act has been anything but affordable. In the first 3 years of Obamacare, premiums in Montana rose by 66%, and they're still rising today. Obamacare robbed consumers of choice and gave hardworking Montanans plans they can't afford. As we work towards solutions that make health care more accessible and affordable, I'll keep fighting to protect those with pre-existing conditions. I co-sponsored the Pre-Existing Conditions Protection Act that ensures patients with pre-existing conditions have access to health insurance. I also voted to ensure those same protections. We need to ensure that those with pre-existing conditions have coverage. House Democrats have said they're for protecting those pre-existing conditions. Unfortunately, Madam Speaker, it seems they're only interested in defending them if the solution includes preserving Obamacare or pursuing a government-run single-payer health care plan. One of the earliest votes we took in this Congress was to lock in protections for Americans with pre-existing conditions. It was a simple and straightforward measure that I enthusiastically voted for. It would protect Americans with pre-existing conditions, period. So simple and straightforward. We should revisit that approach. Unfortunately, Madam Speaker, my friends across the aisle voted down that measure because it appears the majority values trying to score political points more than providing certainty and peace of mind to Americans with pre-existing conditions. I hope they'll come to the table in good faith and choose to work with us to find a bipartisan solution to bring down health care costs and protect people with pre-existing conditions. And with that, Madam Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman from Oregon Reserve.
Appreciate the gentleman's comments and share them. This is H.R. 692, legislation that would guarantee Americans with pre-existing condition are not discriminated against. We have a lot of co-sponsors on this, but we don't have a single Democrat willing to co-sponsor a bill that would provide protection to Americans should this judge's decision be upheld. And that's my argument today. Why wouldn't we go ahead and schedule this and pass this and move this to the floor so that if by some means this judge's decision is upheld, Americans' pre-existing condition would have coverage? And meanwhile, why don't we start hearings on the Medicare for All proposal that Democrats have championed? I've asked for those hearings from my friend. We've not seen that happen, and I know there's a certain dust up in the press even today about alleging the Speaker's own staff person here may have been saying things or not about whether this is a good idea or not. We ought to have a hearing on that because close to 200 million Americans might lose their insurance under this plan. And so there are lots we should be doing here, and with that, I will reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oregon reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to yield 1 minute now to the Speaker of the House, who was so much the force behind making the Affordable Care Act reality.
The Speaker is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding and thank him for the leadership role he played in making America healthier and the original passage of the Affordable Care Act and protecting it from the constant sabotage that the Republicans in the Congress and in the White House have exacted on the Affordable Care Act. I want to pay special tribute to the outside groups, the patient advocacy groups, the little lobbyists, the children, so many people who told their stories, 10,000 events across the country to oppose the Republican constant assault on the Affordable Care Act during the first 2 years of the Trump administration, a time when the president had the White House, the House, and the Senate, and could very well have passed legislation to replace the Affordable Care Act as they said they would do. But they didn't replace it because they don't believe in a government role. Much about the Affordable Care Act has to do with Medicare and how we prolonged the life of Medicare and adjusted funding so that we could reduce the cost of prescription drugs for our seniors. The Republican approach to Medicare is that it should wither on the vine, that there is no place in a free society, in a free economy for Medicare. So let's just understand this. This is not just about the issue or the legislation of the Affordable Care Act. This is about a value system in our country, about understanding that health care is a right for all Americans, not just a privilege of those. Yes, they could get pre-existing conditions covered with rates that go right through the ceiling and are a gift to the insurance industry, but not who make affordable care accessible to all, affordable and accessible to all. So here we are in an unusual situation where the Affordable Care Act is the law of the land. And it is the responsibility of the Justice Department and the administration to defend the law of the land in court. And what are they doing? Just the opposite. And why? Because they don't believe in governance. That's why they're happy to shut down government for any reason. They don't believe in governance. They don't believe in a public role in the well-being of the American people. They don't believe in the Affordable Care Act. And what they are trying to do is strike down every last provision of the ACA, protection for pre-existing conditions. I'll come back to that. Bans on lifetime and annual limits, the Medicaid expansion, Medicare solvency going out for many more years, savings for seniors and their prescription drug costs, the vital premium assistance that makes health coverage affordable for millions of more families, all would be ended if the president and the Republicans in Congress get their way. But I hope it's not all Republicans in Congress, because I hope that some of them will care enough about their constituents and meeting their needs on the subject of pre-existing conditions. How many times during the campaigns did they say, oh, we're for pre-existing conditions, having voted it down over and over and over again? The misrepresentations were almost embarrassing. Let's look the other way so we don't embarrass them any further. It's almost a joke, but it's not funny if you have a pre-existing condition. And what was interesting about the Affordable Care Act is it wasn't just about expanding coverage to 20 million more people. That in itself would be a justification. It was about the over 150 million families who had better coverage on a trajectory of lower cost, better benefits, no pre-existing condition barrier, no lifetime limits, no annual limits, and the rest. If your child is up to 26 years old, your child could be on your policy. And actually the issue of subsidizing those so that everyone could participate, it would be affordable. Can we do more there? We certainly can, and we certainly will. And so I just want to tell the story. As I said, the outside groups were so instrumental in saving us from the Republican sabotage on the Affordable Care Act and on the good health of the American people. And the outside groups, with, as I said, 10,000 events around the country telling stories. Nothing conveys more information and more understanding than people telling their own stories. The statistics are interesting, they're staggering, but the stories are powerful and they make a difference. I'm going to tell the story that I've told before. It's about America's families paying the price and America's children paying the price for this Republican sabotage on the Affordable Care Act. The story I'd like to tell is about Zoe Madison Lynn. Zoe was born with a congenital heart defect in May 2010. She faced the first of her 3 heart surgeries at just 15 hours old. By 6 months old, Zoe was halfway through her lifetime limit that her insurer had placed on her case. She faced a grim future, not just using up her lifetime limit by preschool. Her lifetime limit was used up, but her pre-existing condition had not gone away, but carrying the pre-existing condition that would require attention and care for the rest of her life. Under the ACA, Zoe is protected. She will celebrate her 9th birthday next month. But the Republicans want to take all of that away, not only from Zoe, but from their own constituents. Our Democratic House majority will not let that stand. Dr. King said of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health care is the most shocking and most inhuman because it often results in physical death. Our colleagues are used to our colleague Whip Clyburn telling that story, which I think he heard Dr. King say. On day 1 of this Congress, freshman member from Texas, Congressman Colin Allred, led the way. House Democrats voted to throw the full legal weight of the House against the Texas lawsuit to destroy the ACA. We salute Congressman Allred for his outstanding leadership to protect America's families' health and to reach out to the Republicans to join him in doing so. More than 190 Republicans voted to fully be complicit in that attempt to overthrow the ACA and tear away those health protections. Now, with this resolution, led again by Congressman Allred, we call on our Republican colleagues to go on the record once more. Either they will vote for protecting their constituents' health care, or they vote for taking it away. With this vote, we will see their values and their intentions. House Democrats will always fight to protect families' affordable health, quality care. We don't see it again as an issue or legislation. We see it as a value. A value. It's not just about health care. It's about the good health of America, a source of our strength. After we pass this resolution, we will continue to advance our transformative legislation to reverse the GOP healthcare sabotage, and we will lower healthcare costs and strengthen protections for people with pre-existing medical conditions. And by the way, under the Affordable Care Act, being a woman is no longer a pre-existing medical condition. As a mother of 5, I can attest to that being a pre-existing condition. Democrats are for the people. Lower health care costs by reducing the cost of prescription drugs and preserving the pre-existing condition benefit, increasing wages by building the infrastructure in a green way, and cleaner government. Lower health care costs, bigger paychecks, cleaner government. And once we can reduce the role of dark special interest money in Washington, D.C., people will have the confidence that it is possible that their voices will be heard more strongly than the voices of those who stand in the way of progress. 3 months ago from tomorrow, the members of this institution, Democrats and Republicans, took a solemn oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. Constitution of the United States, after the beautiful preamble of our nation's purpose, Article 1, the legislative branch. The legislative branch's responsibilities are spelled out in the text of the Constitution. This body, the first branch of government, voted to protect the health and well-being of the American people. It is the law of the land. It is the responsibility of the executive branch to protect the law of the land. They have departed from that and therefore departed from our oath to the Constitution to protect and defend. If they have a better idea, we haven't seen it. And on top of that said, and you won't see it until 2021, after the 2020 elections. That's just not good enough, Mr. President. The needs of the American people will not stop right now because you have stopped believing in them. The needs of the American people go on, and we will continue this fight. We will fight in the Congress, we'll fight in the courts, and we'll fight in the court of public opinion. I urge our colleagues and hope that we can have some Republican support from the other side of the aisle to vote to protect America's families and their health care, and therefore strengthen America. With that, I yield back, I vote and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Madam Speaker, and I hope before the Speaker of the House leaves, she will listen to this. I was moved by her story about a young child with a congenital heart defect. But nobody's going to lecture me about the need to protect people with pre-existing conditions or the need to repeal the lifetime caps. Let me tell you a story about a young man with a heart defect. February 7th, 1994. He was born in Portland, Oregon, at Oregon Health Sciences University, with hypoplastic left heart syndrome. Would require immediate surgery and multiple surgeries to try and save his life or a complete heart transplant. Tragically, that little boy did not live long enough to be flown to Loma Linda Hospital, California, for that heart transplant. His name, Garrison Daniel Walden. He died the next day. Nobody is going to tell me about the need to protect people with pre-existing conditions. Nobody is going to lecture me about the need to get rid of caps on lifetime. My wife and I dealt with those issues directly, and I will always stand up for people who face similar challenges. It's not what this is about today, and you can laugh if you want. I yield the gentleman from California 1 minute.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank Congressman Walden for his sombering words, for his actions. He has a bill that will protect pre-existing conditions. The difference about that than today, it's actually a bill. This is a resolution. I always thought when you ran for Congress, you'd want to do more than a press release. Apparently, it's different with a new election, Madam Speaker. Show me your budget, show me your values. It's been said so many times on this floor. Those were the words that have been recited by Speaker Pelosi quite frequently. You could have a whole ring of videos of her just saying those exact words. But of course, that was before the newly minted Democrat majority quickly decided they won't be introducing a budget. Madam Speaker, I wonder if America will question the values. It appears they won't be sharing their values with the American people. But as if we had questions to what those values were, this week removes all doubt. Madam Speaker, we're celebrating 40 years of C-SPAN. But I wonder if those who are watching today understand what is happening. You see, in this floor, they learned early on, even from a childhood of Schoolhouse Rock, I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill. This is not a bill we're talking about. This isn't even a resolution that goes to the Senate. This will never end up with the President. This will do nothing for your health care. But what will it do? It will make a great press release. The difference, Madam Speaker, in one election is what happens on this floor. The difference is, do you really want to protect people with pre-existing conditions? Because, Madam Speaker, there is an individual that has a bill that is filed, that has co-sponsorship, that is sitting in committee, that the Democrats control. They didn't mark it up. They didn't talk about it. They wrote a resolution. To those who are watching on C-SPAN, I know what you've watched on this floor before. I know what you watched in the last Congress. That we sat and we talked about not a resolution for children's health, for the CHIP program. We wrote a bill. We extended it longer than anyone's ever dreamed possible, a full decade. And yes, Madam Speaker, we had to do it with one side of the aisle, because the majority on the other side of the aisle didn't even write a press release supporting it. They voted no. To those who are watching in C-SPAN and questioning what has gone on in this House, yeah, they watched in the last Congress when we had an opioid epidemic that we wrote a bill. We didn't write a press release and we didn't write a resolution. Or when the National Institute of Health, where you can really care about an individual with health care and solve a problem, we didn't write a resolution about giving them more money. We actually voted for it. We actually moved it through committee, and we put a bill, and we funded $3 billion more. To those who are watching on C-SPAN, don't change the channel. Don't wonder if the words that were used before, show me your budget, show me your values, but there is no budget. And you're probably going to question their values. Show me the bill and show me your values. I guess that's the new line we should ask. Because what does a resolution do? Maybe we can all get together and go to Rayburn Room today and have a press release. What? Let's go further. Let's do a press conference. Let's get really serious about a problem. And let's write a resolution for the floor. Because that problem will still exist. A lot of people put a lot of effort into running for office. A lot of people make a lot of promises. And the American expect legislation to solve them, not a resolution. You know what's most ironic today? If you wanted to solve the problem, there are options there. If we're worried about a lawsuit, if we're worried about pre-existing conditions, go to Congressman Walden's bill. Let's bring that on the floor. It's not a resolution. We'll have to vote for something different. We'll have to actually vote for a bill. It's interesting that on the other side of the aisle, Madam Speaker, I heard people were concerned, that Republicans were concerned about what Obamacare has done, that premiums have been risen, that the promise we were given that if you liked your health care, you could keep it, and to millions of Americans that proved to be a lie and false. We're not the only ones who believe that's been a failure. If that was not true, why does half of the members on the other side of the aisle co-sponsor a bill that says Medicare for all? They must believe it's not working either. Or maybe they want to take more health care from individuals. I'm not quite sure. Because the way I look at Medicare for all, it's got a great name. Anybody at 65, they should get Medicare, and I'll stand with you. But you shouldn't take away 158 million Americans' private health insurance, because that's exactly what you do. Why don't you make another promise to the American public and deny them their health care? Or why don't you even go further? For everyone who's on Medicare Advantage, that goes away as well. Or for everyone who's on a Medicare itself, you're going to bankrupt it. You got that in legislation. That's not a press release. Why don't we bring that to the floor of committee? Why don't we debate that? And Madam Speaker, when I sat on this floor and I heard the words used from the other side of the aisle, from the leader of that side of the aisle, to say Republicans don't care about Medicare, that was a lie. Medicare Part D. You know, when you talk to seniors, you know what they're most concerned about? The price of prescription drugs. Well, for those C-SPAN viewers that had more than 40 years to watch it, Republicans were in the majority. You know what they did? They didn't bring a press release down with the resolution. They brought a bill. They created Medicare Part D to lower prescription drug prices. It's been one of the most effective programs around. And you know what we had to do? We had to do it alone because we passed legislation. We didn't pass a press release. Madam Speaker, shame. Shame on an individual that would believe that lie to the American public about their own health care, lie about another side, but more importantly, say you care about Americans' health and bring a resolution. I want to see everybody go home this weekend, go back to their constituents, and tell them what they did about pre-existing conditions. They passed a resolution when they could have passed a bill. I happen to be the leader of the Republicans, and I stand here in this body, and tell you we support pre-existing conditions. I tell you to bring his bill up, Congressman Walden, and we'll support that bill on this floor. We won't support shams. We won't support press releases because we care about the American health. And we will not support kicking 158 million off their health care. I know half the body on the other side has co-sponsored that. That's even further than I've seen before. They want to end Medicare Advantage. What are you going to say that to the seniors? And that's not a press release. That's something you're really going after. If you are serious about your words, if you believe you care and are concerned about a court case because maybe you wrote a bill that isn't constitutional, you could have solved it today. You know what we could be talking about today? You own the majority. You control the floor. What's most interesting, the majority of bills that you brought to the floor in this new majority, you brought more bills and resolutions to the floor than even passed the committee. But you sat here and told us it's for the people. You were about to have 100 days, but it's 100 days of disappointment. I never thought a majority would want to claim how many press conferences or how many resolutions you could pass on the floor. But you're setting a record. You're setting a record while you're failing the American public. You know what you could be doing right now? If you really cared about fixing our health care system and protecting Americans with pre-existing conditions, that you could do one of the three things in the face of this lawsuit. And let's not lie to the American public. They could repeal the individual mandate. Boom, lawsuit's gone. They could reimpose the penalty. You voted for it before, so why don't you vote for it again? Or they could put a bill on the floor that explicitly protects pre-existing conditions. The difference is that's a bill, not a resolution. Maybe if you had a lot of power, maybe if you really felt strongly about this, make a resolution that even goes to the Senate so the Senate can talk about it too. Or really, if you really care, make a bill. Write a bill. Don't write a press release. Don't lie to the American public. They are smarter than this. You know, the words I've heard today, the line that will sit up to speak, Not one of you will use the term of a bill. Not one of you can look the American public in the eye and say you're protecting pre-existing conditions. But what you can say, Madam Speaker, is you're denying a bill that would protect pre-existing conditions and come to the floor because the Republicans authored it. This is an honorable floor. This is a floor that makes history. This is a floor that has changed and shown the values of America to lead the world. But it has not done that by doing resolutions. It is a shame that we're trying to put a resolution on the floor. Is this why you ran? Is this what you craved, to become the majority? I didn't hear any of my constituents say, I want you to go there. Because I heard this language. I heard this language on the other side, Madam Speaker, just from the last speaker. We will fight in court. We will fight on the floor. We will fight in the public's opinion. You know what fighting means if you want to succeed? Put a bill. I didn't know fighting was fighting a press release. Don't take America's time and don't waste it, because that's exactly what you're doing. You want to tell stories? Go tell the stories to the individuals that are concerned about this. Go tell those individuals you did nothing to solve it. Go tell those individuals you denied a bill to come to the floor that could solve the problem. Be honest, but stop wasting our time. And if you don't want to lead, get out of the way, because we will definitely solve it. I yield back.
Gentleman from Oregon reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 3 minutes now to the gentleman from North Carolina, who is the vice chair of our Health Subcommittee.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding time, and thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I rise to support H.Res. 271. This resolution, I would say to the minority leader, is a statement. It's a statement by Democrats of our position on the Affordable Care Act. It's not surprising to me that you would not want the facts to be before the American people. That's what this resolution is about. On day one of his administration, President Obama announced he would address the critical need for affordable health care for millions of uninsured Americans. He reminded us that nearly 50 million Americans were uninsured. Low-income childless adults could not benefit from Medicaid. Millions of seniors were not fully benefiting from prescription drug benefits under Medicare Part D because of the donut hole. He told us that parents needed insurance on their children to age 26. And finally, Madam Speaker, President Obama stressed that insurance companies were increasing premiums and not providing quality coverage, and they were discriminating based on pre-existing conditions, high copays and high deductibles. After much debate, we passed Obamacare. It has made a difference in health accessibility and health outcomes. It's not a perfect solution, but it has impacted millions of lives. We want to make Obamacare better. We want to make it more affordable. With bipartisan cooperation, I would say to my friend from Oregon, with bipartisan cooperation, we can do that, and we can do it effectively. But Republicans have repeatedly tried to legislate Obamacare out of existence with no replacement. This Congress has repeatedly said no to any repeal. On February 26, Republican plaintiffs filed a lawsuit in the Northern District of Texas, contending that the minimum essential coverage provision is unconstitutional. And since Republicans removed the mandate penalty, the entire law is unconstitutional. That was their claim. 3 months later, Attorney General Sessions announced that the Trump administration wouldn't defend the minimum essential coverage claim, and that the Trump administration would argue that pre-existing condition protections should be invalidated. However, the Trump administration said that the remaining parts of the law could be severed or separated, and the law could remain intact. The court heard the case, and as we all know, it was declared, the Affordable Care Act was declared to be unconstitutional. It is now on appeal. On March 28th of this year, President Trump changed his position. On appeal, he is now aligning with the Republican plaintiffs and thumbing his nose, Madam Speaker, thumbing his nose again at this Congress. The Affordable Care Act, as the Speaker said a few moments ago, is the law of the land, and Republicans are refusing to defend it. Protection of pre-existing conditions is the law of the land, Mr. President. The final insult came this morning when President Trump confirmed that he will ask the higher courts to throw out the entire law and that he will have a replacement ready the day after the election.
The gentleman's time has expired.
And so should the American people.
Would the gentleman like additional time?
I'm complete, Mr. Chairman.
You.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd now like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice, from the Ways and Means Committee.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you. We stand here today with another in a series of weekly messaging bills. I wonder what next week we'll deal with. I'm sure it'll be another whipsaw response to the headlines of the day. If you truly want to protect pre-existing conditions, people with pre-existing conditions, as Republicans do, bring forth Mr. Walden's bill. It has teeth in the event that this lawsuit is upheld and the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional. It will protect people with pre-existing conditions. The Speaker, Mrs. Pelosi, a minute ago said that the Republicans' position on health care was a joke. Well, I'll tell you what's a joke, and that is to call the Affordable Care Act successful. The promises on which the Affordable Care Act were based were that we would cover all Americans, that the premiums would go down, that if you like your doctor, you could keep it, and that if you like your insurance policy, you could keep it. Clearly, almost every existing insurance policy was declared invalid. You can only keep your doctor if he's in your plan and your hospital. Premiums have gone from an average of $225 in 2013, just before the Affordable Care Act was enacted, to $475 average cost for an individual policy today, almost a 250% increase. What did we get for that? Before the Affordable Care Act, 85% of Americans were covered. Before the Affordable Care Act, 85% of Americans were covered. At the peak, after the Affordable Care Act last year, 91% of Americans were covered. We covered 6% more people, mostly because we gave them insurance policy with the Medicare expansion. We covered 6% more people, but what was the cost of that? The 85% that were already covered had to pay 250% more for their health insurance. That is completely absurd. And don't lecture me about people with pre-existing conditions. I have a son who had a congenital heart defect. I had a son who, as a 7-month-old child, was in a car wreck and had a brain injury. Both pre-existing conditions. Throughout their life, they were covered. For a brief period of time, South Carolina, like almost every other state in the country, had protections for pre-existing conditions before the Affordable Care Act. Under the health insurance pool in South Carolina, they had to pay 30% more. And it irritated me as a father that my children had to pay 30% more for their health insurance. But guess what? Under the Affordable Care Act, instead of having to pay 30% more, they have to pay 250% more, and their deductibles have tripled. And you call that a success? In what world is that a success? Republicans want to protect people with pre-existing conditions. We've voted repeatedly to do it. We have bills out there that will do it. Stop with the messaging, stop with the lies, and let's move forward and do something that actually works. Let's move forward and protect people with pre-existing conditions in the event that this law is declared unconstitutional. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from South Carolina. And I would just point out, Gallup just announced in a survey 65 million Americans, 20%, put off treatment this last year and borrowed $88 billion to cover their health care costs. So we know there are problems out there we need to address. Mr. Speaker, could I inquire as to how much time each side has remaining?
Gentleman from Oregon has 9.5 minutes. The gentleman from New Jersey has 22.5.
I'll reserve balance of my time.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Illinois, the chair of our Consumer Protection and Commerce Subcommittee.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Well, clearly we've hit a nerve with the Republicans on the Affordable Care Act, which they opposed before it began, have been opposing it for 9 years, promising to come up with some sort of a repeal and replace, never being able to do it, and now standing up here and saying life was better before the Affordable Care Act. Amazing. People with pre-existing conditions love the Affordable Care Act. Why are we here in the majority today? Because the American people came to understand that before the Affordable Care Act, children born with pre-existing conditions from the day of birth were not able to be covered by health care, that there were limits and how much insurance companies would pay per year or per lifetime caps, and making families live in fear and disaster of financial chaos. So, Mr. Speaker, I rise today to condemn the Trump administration and their decision to support the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, not in the Congress, but now in the courts. They couldn't defeat it here. They tried when they had the majority in both houses and could not repeal it. You know, when I came here, being a woman was essentially a pre-existing condition. Women paid more for health care, sometimes 40% more, just because we're women. Pregnancy was very rarely covered by insurance, and now women are covered for those things like preventive services, mammograms, pregnancy. The Affordable Care Act has let people 26 years old stay on their parents' policies. No wonder the American people have completely turned around and understood the sham that the Republicans were offering and support the Affordable Care Act. We are here today to support it. Thank you. No, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Oregon's recognized.
And now recognize my friend from Georgia for 2 minutes, I believe.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
I'd like to thank my colleague from Oregon, and I've listened to this debate as it's gone on, and the bottom line is, if you listen to the Democrats, you would think that they had stuck it to the insurance industry with all of the rules and the laws that they passed. I thought, as we talk about values, I thought I'd give you a few values. Aetna in 2010 was trading at $27.39 a share. In 2018, it was $187 a share. You know who you stuck it to? You stuck it to the American citizens. You took the money out of our pockets and you put it into the hands of the insurance industry. You don't want to follow Aetna? Let's talk about United Healthcare. $29 a share in 2010. In 2018, $246.54 a share. How did that happen? How did that happen? If the American citizens were getting a square deal from the legislation that you passed, that you could only pass if the insurance industry didn't object, how did United stock go from $29 a share to $246 a share? If that's not enough, how about Humana? How about Humana? $29 a share in 2010 to $246 a share in 2018. How did this happen? This happened because you left the insurance industry exempt from the antitrust laws of the country. Now, how did that work out for the American citizen? We got a mandate by the Democratic Party to purchase a product from an industry that is exempt from the antitrust laws of the country. Now, there are flaws in the legislation that you passed. I'm amazed at your refusal to accept that. You can't even buy an Affordable Care Act contract today. You realize the next time you can buy it is January 1st of next year. January 1st of next year. If you're uninsured right now, y'all have been telling the American public, if you're uninsured and you go to the doctor and the doctor says you got cancer, you can get a contract the next day. It's just not true. You can't get it until January 1st of 2020. It is a poorly worded piece of legislation. Regardless of the intent, it is a poorly worded piece of legislation that moved money from the individual citizens of this country to the pockets of the insurance industry, and it needs to be rewritten. Thank you, and I yield the remainder of my time.
Reserve the balance of mine.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I yield now, Mr. Speaker, 3.5 minutes to the gentleman from Rhode Island.
I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized for 3
Thank you,
minutes.
Mr. Speaker. I want to acknowledge the leadership of Congressman Colin Allred, who has been an incredible advocate for his community in Dallas and for millions of Americans whose health care President Trump and our Republican colleagues are trying to take away. President Trump has claimed over and over again that he wants to protect access to health care. And he's even announced recently that it is a secret plan that he'll make available to the American people after the 2020 election. But as is true with any con man and charlatan, when you dig a little past the surface of the president's words, the facts tell a much different story. Last week, the president's Justice Department asked a court to eliminate every single protection and benefit that the Affordable Care Act has provided. Democrats won the majority because the American people understand that we're fighting to protect their health care. And now Republicans have moved away from the Congress to try to take away health care from millions and millions of Americans in the courts. Let's be clear about what this means. President Trump wants to repeal the caps on out-of-pocket costs. He wants to eliminate the prescription drug savings for seniors and end the Medicaid expansion. If he succeeds in this litigation, it will be legal for insurance companies to limit the amount of coverage someone can get in their lifetime. It will deny access to people with pre-existing conditions, and it will allow insurance companies to sell junk plans that offer no coverage or no real coverage for the American people. Democrats have a better plan, and the minority leader will be happy to know there are actually bills to do it. And we're going to strengthen the protections for people with pre-existing conditions. We're going to expand access to insurance for more working men and women. And we're going to bring down the cost of prescription drugs with bills like my legislation, the CREATES Act, to allow more generic drugs into the marketplace. Look, we take a lot of complicated votes in this chamber. This is not one of them. This vote is very simple. It's a vote in favor of this resolution is a vote for access to quality, affordable health care. A vote against it is a vote for the interests of insurance companies at the expense of working people. I know we're members of the Democratic caucus, and we ran on this. We're committed to it. We're fighting every day to protect the Affordable Care Act and to build on its success and to improve it. The Republicans' last vote was Trump Care, which took away health coverage from 23 million Americans. And that's why they were rejected in the midterms. People want members of Congress to stand up and fight to protect their access to quality, affordable health care, to protect their access to coverage for pre-existing conditions, to drive down the cost of prescription drugs, and to end these junk plans that, in fact, don't provide coverage to the American people. This resolution is a strong statement of our position on this. I urge my Republican colleagues, don't be afraid of the resolution. Don't be afraid that it's going to expose that you actually don't support efforts to protect access to health care, because you have an easy solution to that problem. Vote for it. Show the American people you care about the quality of their health care, that you want to expand access, strengthen the Affordable Care Act, and support this excellent resolution. And with that, I yield back.
Time is very good. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
I'll reserve for now, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes now to the gentleman from Georgia.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. President Trump's Department of Justice letter seeking the invalidation of the entire Affordable Care Act by the Fifth Circuit is nothing short of self-sabotage. The Trump position in Texas v. United States would deny coverage for those with pre-existing conditions, dismantle protections on out-of-pocket costs, and the ban on annual and lifetime caps, and the return of the notorious donut hole for seniors on expensive medications would come forward again. I support this resolution. It's important that we band together to protect the Affordable Care Act and its protections against junk insurance policies. The American people deserve to know whether their representative is going to fight for them and vote to condemn the DOJ's actions, or if they will simply fall in line behind this president on his thoughtless and heartless mission to destroy access to the health care system for millions of Americans. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Virginia, Ms. Wexton.
Gentlelady from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of House Resolution 271, a resolution condemning the Trump administration's legal campaign to take away America's health care. Here's what health care means. It's the freedom and security to live your life the way you choose. It can be the difference between financial security and bankruptcy, or life and death. Donald Trump and congressional Republicans want to use the courts to take health insurance away from 21 million Americans. They want to eliminate protections for the more than 133 million Americans with pre-existing conditions. Now, the Affordable Care Act is not perfect, but never in American history has the uninsured rate been lower than it is today. But rather than be honest about what's working, rather than coming to the table to work across the aisle and fix what's wrong, Republicans are fighting tooth and nail to overturn the ACA, with no plan except one that was so bad they couldn't pass it when they controlled both houses of Congress. Meanwhile, the Democratic majority is proposing real solutions and smart health care policies that will lower costs and expand coverage. The contrast couldn't be more clear. Democrats want quality, affordable health coverage for every American, and Republicans don't. I encourage my colleagues to vote yes on this resolution, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm now proud to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, resident pharmacist on the Energy and Commerce Committee, Mr. Carter.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, the Affordable Care Act is not working for too many Americans. I welcome all efforts to lower cost, to increase choice, and to protect those with pre-existing conditions. Remember, the very first thing, the very first floor vote we pushed as Republicans this Congress was to solidify protections for those with pre-existing conditions. It was the first thing we did. We did it right out of the gate. While Republicans have stood ready to work on lowering costs and increasing choices, so far the Democrats, the Democratic majority, have only tried to double down on the ACA. On the Energy and Commerce Committee, the only solution we've seen from Democrats are partisan bills that throw billions of unpaid-for dollars at a broken system, at a failed experiment. If my Democratic colleagues were serious about helping patients, they would work with us on reforms to lower costs and increase choices. The fact is, we could vote on independent legislation that protects patients with pre-existing conditions. The fact is, if my Democratic colleagues were serious about their concerns over this lawsuit, they could legislatively end this lawsuit once and for all. We could vote to repeal the individual mandate. That would immediately invalidate the lawsuit. They could vote to reinstate the individual mandate penalty. That would also stop the lawsuit in its tracks. But instead, we're here to vote on a resolution about politics, not solutions. It's clear that Democrats would much rather try to score political points than to protect the ACA. They would have surprised me 2 years ago, but now the Democratic Party seems to have already moved on from the Affordable Care Act. Instead of truly working on improvements to the ACA, Democrats are focused on their $32 trillion plan to kick 152 million people off their insurance for their one-size-fits-all government-run health care plan. I encourage my Democratic friends to stop the politics and to work with us to protect those with pre-existing conditions, to lower health care costs, and to increase choices for patients. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield.
I reserve.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, can I inquire about the amount of time that remains on each side?
Gentleman from New Jersey has 14.5 minutes, and the gentleman from Oregon has 5.5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 2 minutes at this time to the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania.
The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania has 2 minutes, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to condemn this administration's latest attempt to do with the health care provided by the Affordable Care Act. The Department of Justice's decision to go after the health care of millions of Americans by seeking a ruling that the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional underscores its belief that health care should be a luxury reserved for the privileged few. Only now we've moved from repeal and replace to just flat-out repeal. I could not disagree more strongly. In my home state of Pennsylvania, the ability to get health insurance regardless of chronic illness has saved countless lives. Tens of thousands of my constituents have gotten health care for the first time under the Affordable Care Act. Those with pre-existing conditions have received peace of mind, and many, myself included, have been able to keep our children on their health plans even as they become adults themselves. The administration's callous decision to continue undermining the Affordable Care Act endangers my constituents, just as it endangers the lives of Americans in every district of our country. We were chosen to serve in this House to protect Americans who need us most, and that means protecting their health care. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote yes on this important resolution, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, it is my great honor and privilege to recognize the Republican whip of the House, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, an incredibly important member of our committee, for 2 minutes.
The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my gentleman for yielding and for his leadership on health care. And first of all, Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this resolution, which has nothing to do with actually helping improve the health care and the costs, especially, that so many millions of people are enduring because the Affordable Care Act is anything but affordable, Mr. Speaker. And let's keep in mind what this resolution is about. It's not about changing any health care policy. It doesn't do that. It's been made clear. It's attempting just to try to take cheap shots at the president while diverting attention away from what this lawsuit that you see moving through the courts is really all about. Because, Mr. Speaker, if the health care law that my friends on the other side of the aisle rushed through Congress and passed is held unconstitutional, they have nobody to blame but themselves. Let's keep in mind, and they want you to forget this, Mr. Speaker, but let's go back to those days when they rammed this bill through and the infamous statement, you have to pass the bill to find out what's in it. Nobody read that bill that voted for it. We said back then that it was unconstitutional, and oh, by the way, not only was it that, but it's actually led to dramatic increases in cost for families. And so someone with a pre-existing condition who we want to protect, by the way, Mr. Speaker, but we don't just want to protect the fact that they shouldn't be able to have costs go up. We want to help them lower their costs for health insurance and lower their premiums. So many millions of Americans are not only facing double-digit increases, but people with pre-existing conditions in many cases are facing a $10,000 deductible. So they have no access to health care, Mr. Speaker. Why don't we focus on the underlying problem? We on the Republican side support protecting people with pre-existing conditions, but we also want to lower their premiums and lower their deductibles. The other side wants to see their costs continue to go up. That's the biggest difference between the two sides. We ought to focus on lowering premiums. Let families make those decisions, not unelected bureaucrats in Washington. That's what we ought to be focused on. This resolution falls short. I yield back.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield now 3 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, who's the chairman of the Education and Labor Committee.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, too often we forget what our health care system was like before we passed the Affordable Care Act. Before the ACA, health care costs were skyrocketing. Insurance could deny people for coverage if they have a pre-existing condition. Policies did not have to provide essential benefits. People were losing their insurance at alarming rates. Before the Affordable Care Act, insurers could place annual and lifetime caps on insurance coverage. Today, the Affordable Care Act ensures that 130 million Americans with pre-existing conditions can have access to the health care, peace of mind, and financial security that comes with quality, affordable health coverage. Now, we've heard a lot about what we can do to make things better. We've heard about a bill that protects those with pre-existing conditions. The problem with that, Mr. Speaker, is if you allow people to wait until they get sick before they buy insurance, they will wait until they get sick before they buy insurance. Those buying insurance are on average sicker, and the costs tend to go up. Fewer people can afford it. The healthy people drop out, and the costs go up. There's a name for this cycle. It's called the death spiral. Every time they try to protect those with pre-existing conditions without the supports of the Affordable Care Act, there is a death spiral out of control. In Washington State, in 3 years, they tried that. In the 3 years, nobody could buy insurance. New York was in the death spiral when we passed the Affordable Care Act. When we passed the Affordable Care Act, the cost for individual insurance dropped more than 50%. So we know we just can't protect those with pre-existing conditions without the supports and tax credits available under the Affordable Care Act. But we do know what a replacement plan looks like. The Republicans voted on such a thing that was actually evaluated by the Congressional Budget Office, finding that if their bill passed, about 20-some million fewer people would have insurance. They talk about costs. Under their plan, the costs would go up 20% the first year. Insurance policies would not have to cover essential benefits as they do now, and those with pre-existing conditions would lose their protection, lose many of their protections. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution and support people with pre-existing conditions so that they can have access to the care they need to live healthy and fulfilling lives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentleman yield. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
I'll continue to reserve. I might inquire my friend from New Jersey if he has any other speakers. I don't believe our side does, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I have no additional speakers. I'm prepared to close at this time.
I think
the gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll yield myself time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we've had a very important debate today. I just wish that that debate had occurred on H.R. 692. This is the legislation that we should put in place in case the decision that the judge made in the Texas case that said Obamacare was unconstitutional is upheld. If that's upheld, then there's going to be this problem, this gap that everybody's talking about. This is an honest attempt to make sure there is a safety net for people with pre-existing conditions, H.R. 692. You're welcome to co-sponsor it. I wish we would move it. I always think it's, maybe it's the old Eagle Scout in me. You're supposed to be prepared and ready, and that you help people. I would tell you that Republicans also believed we should take care of people with pre-existing conditions. Republicans also supported getting real lifetime caps on insurance policies and many of the other things you've heard about today. And we will continue to. But we also led the effort to deal with the nation's opioid crisis, made it bipartisan, brought it to the floor, it became law. When seniors couldn't afford their medicines, it was Republicans under George W. Bush who put Medicare Part D into law, and we had to fight Democrats to do that. And then seniors didn't have to go to Mexico or Canada or somewhere to get their drugs anymore, and it's been highly successful. The costs are 40% or more less than what the Congressional Budget Office said it would be, and premiums have remained low. Now we need to do some modernization there. Republicans also passed the longest extension of children's health insurance in the history of the country, 10 years fully funded. Democrats voted against it over and over again on this House floor less than a year ago. Community health centers, incredibly important part of our network. I led the effort to get them funded at the highest levels ever. That funding is going to run out, and we don't have a plan from the Democrats yet, and we're told we're not even going to have a budget on how to go forward. I think we can find bipartisan consensus there. We are working together right now, and we'll have a markup tomorrow in the Energy and Commerce Committee to address the drug issue and the cost of drugs. And as I said earlier, I can't remember a president of the United States more engaged in getting better prices for consumers than this one. Donald Trump has led the country in an initiative to drive down the cost of drugs. And Congress is responding, and in a bipartisan way, and that's a good thing. We should do that here, Mr. Speaker. The resolution before us today, if you're just watching or listening to my colleagues, is just that. It's a resolution. It'll never leave the House because it's only for the House. It is the it is the taxpayer-funded equivalent of a press release. That's all it is. And we know that there are members who never have accepted the outcome of the 2016 election, and no matter what the president says or does, they want to do a resolution or attack him. Yet the American people want us to come here and get our work done and stand up for them. So rather than that resolution, I genuinely wish that H.R. 692, a bill that would protect people with pre-existing conditions, was what we were voting on today. And we stand ready to work with Democrats to get that done and provide that safety net that these Americans need. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I urge opposition to this resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yield. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, before I talk about House Resolution 271, which is before the House today, I wanted to respond to my ranking member's statements about H.R. 692. This is the bill that he repeatedly has mentioned on the Republican side. And I wanted to point out that the Republican bill, H.R. 692, under that legislation, you could theoretically buy insurance if you have a pre-existing condition, but it's very deceptive because the bill would still allow insurers to set premiums based on health status, resulting in individuals with pre-existing conditions being charged substantially more or priced out of the market. The Republican bill does not include critical ACA consumer protections, including community rating, essential health benefits requirements, and annual or lifetime prohibitions. Basically, the GOP bill would allow insurance companies to once again discriminate against 130 million Americans with pre-existing conditions because they would be priced out of coverage because they wouldn't be healthy enough. Individuals with pre-existing conditions like cancer or diabetes could face extremely unaffordable premiums and again priced out of the care that they desperately need. And the GOP bill would also put significant financial burden on older Americans while doing very little to lower costs for young adults. So, this Republican bill leaves Americans worse off and does nothing really to protect people from pre-existing conditions in reality. Now, if I could speak again in support of House Resolution 271, which is before us today, that condemns the Trump administration's legal campaign to take away Americans' health care. As you know, last Monday night, the Justice Department filed a brief saying that they wanted the court to repeal the Affordable Care Act in its entirety. And the Trump administration's announcement last week that it would actively support this frivolous lawsuit striking down the entire Affordable Care Act shows the president's shameless disregard for the health and well-being of the American people, in my opinion. If the Trump administration got its way in court and the ACA is struck down, tens of millions of Americans would lose their health coverage overnight. Hundreds of millions would immediately lose protections for pre-existing conditions, and we would be sent barreling back to the days of lifetime limits and price discrimination against women based on their gender. Republicans had their chance to repeal and replace the ACA, and the American people overwhelmingly rejected their plan. And now, by refusing to defend the ACA in court, the Trump administration is asking the courts to do what President Trump and a Republican Congress could not do, and that's repeal the ACA and all the protections that it includes for the American people. So, Mr. Speaker, I've heard my colleagues on the other side of the aisle repeatedly claim that they stand for protections for people with pre-existing conditions and for other protections included in the Affordable Care Act. Well, now is your chance to show it. We have an opportunity today to send a clear message that will not support this reckless attack that imperils the well-being of millions of hardworking Americans. The time for empty promises has expired. It's time to act. The Trump administration is determined to destroy protections for pre-existing conditions and to tear down every last benefit guaranteed by the Affordable Care Act. And today's vote is an opportunity to stand up in solidarity against this heartless attack. And I urge all of my colleagues to join me in supporting HRES 271, to send a clear message. We'll not stand idly by while the Trump administration wages an all-out assault on Americans' health care. And I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 274, the previous question is ordered on the resolution and the preamble. The question is on adoption of the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
For the yeas and nays.
Have it, the resolution. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Yes, I'd ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. The sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.